She made some of the best-loved public sculpture in Britain and beyond, works that shape the way we see our cities and landscapes. Born in 1903, Barbara Hepworth worked right up until her death in 1975, producing nearly 600 pieces. Working primarily in stone, wood and bronze, she was fascinated by our relationship to the natural world. She experimented constantly with ways to open up sculptural form in order to involve the viewer. She wanted her work not simply to be looked at, but experienced. This summer, Tate Britain will stage the first major survey of Hepworth's work to be seen in London since 1968. It is complemented by 2 exhibitions here at the Hepworth in Wakefield, the city where she was born. These exhibitions focus on the beginning and the end of Hepworth's life. A Greater Freedom looks at her prolific last decade, while Hepworth in Yorkshire, which opens on the 16th of May, explores her formative early years. At the Royal College of Art in London in the 1920s, Hepworth and her fellow student Henry Moore went against current thinking by carving directly into stone, rather than making preparatory models in clay. Hepworth's stylised, simplifying approach caught on, and her work was well received by critics. Hepworth's work moved towards abstraction in the 1930s as she engaged with the artistic debates of the day, visiting the Parisian studios of Picasso, Braque and Mondrian. This is Mother and Child from 1934. Already you can see the abstracting influence of the natural world. Their soft, rounded profiles suggest stones on a beach or a landscape of rolling hills. When the Second World War broke out, Hepworth and her husband, the artist Ben Nicholson, moved with their family to St Ives in Cornwall. Hepworth began experimenting with small sculptures in plaster and wood, round forms with sections scooped out, using colour and strings to articulate the negative space. Hepworth was constantly innovating. She began working in bronze in the late 1950s, which enabled her to really open out her sculptures, as you can see from this work here, Hollow Form with Inner Form from 1968. Bronze also allowed her to work on a large scale suited to the public commissions that she was receiving, such as Winged Figure for the John Lewis department store and Single Form for the United Nations Plaza in New York. These were productive years for Hepworth, now divorced from Nicholson and living alone in St Ives. The title of this exhibition, A Greater Freedom, is taken from something Hepworth said in 1968. While always remaining constant to my conviction about truth to material, I have found a greater freedom for myself. Can you tell me why Hepworth was so prolific in her later years?
I think there are probably lots of reasons, but certainly there are 3 big ones. And one was that she reached a certain level of success in her career. So she had success post-war. She represented Britain at the Venice Biennale in 1950. She won the first prize at the Sao Paulo Biennial in 1959. And she also started to have big public commissions from this. So it meant that she had more financial freedom. And that meant that she could, for example, work with materials that she hadn't maybe been able to work with. And then that resulted in more space as well. So in late 1960s, she purchased Palais de Danse, a big space in St Ives which was previously a dance studio, as you might imagine, and that's enabled her to take on more ambitious commissions. And I think also a final thing was just time. So in earlier years, she had a family. She had triplets as well as a previous son from a previous marriage, and whereas once you got to this point, the children had grown up. She was no longer married, and could just focus on her art.
Can you tell me a bit about the specific sort of ideas that she was working on in the 30s that she then returned to in her kind of final decade?
I think that something that really characterises Hepworth's work in the 30s is the move from figuration and representation to abstraction. And that's what she's really been known for in the 30s. So she started piercing the form actually back in the 20s when, it would be this gap would be, the piercing in the form would be the gap between the arm and the body. And then later that just became an abstract whole that didn't have anything relating to the real world in it, or had some sort of ideas of form, balancing, harmony, and things like that. And I think that that abstraction continued in later life, but in a way she kind of synthesized the two things. So in the 30s, the earlier figurative works were called things like Mother and Child, and you could see the mother and child within them, and then later they became things like two forms. Whereas here, for example, you have this work which is called Mother and Child, but it is very abstract. There isn't so much of a sense of a mother cradling a child, but there is a sense of a relationship between two entities.
How was Hepworth responding to things that were happening at the time?
I think there's a tendency to see her as making these sort of universal forms that are timeless, but there actually are elements within the works that she made during the 60s that you can relate to things that were happening at the time. She was very inspired by the moon landings in the 60s and just general exploration of space that happened in that decade. You can see those forms of kind of celestial bodies occurring in prints as well as in other works, and particularly the polished bronze works. She was also based in Cornwall when the satellite dishes were made at Goonhilly. There is a work, Three Hemispheres, which has these kind of semicircular faces, which she said could be linked to the satellite dishes at Goonhilly, but she said also could be just faces looking out in the landscapes.
Hepworth is often seen as a Cornish artist. Her connection to St Ives was so strong. Do you think it's fair to define her by her place?
It makes a lot of sense why people have done that. She lived in St Ives for a really long time. She was very much part of that place, and it was a very inspirational landscape for her, so that does make a lot of sense. But I would argue that actually it wasn't so much that specific landscape as landscape in general. I mean, she's written about how the Cornish landscape kind of reminded her of the landscape in Yorkshire. When she was younger, her father was the county surveyor and would drive around through the county. She's written about how sculpturally she experienced the landscape then, you know, the roads defining the forms of the hills.
So Tate's exhibition this summer is about placing Hepworth in the 20th century. What would you say her significance is as an international artist at the time?
She was really important in several ways. The introduction of direct carving back into common artistic practice, I mean, that was something that is now, you know, so taken for granted that artists are working with their hands to make kind of the final product. Also, you know, you can't overstate the importance of her move to abstraction. And again, she was working within another group of artists, but she was very much a kind of driving force behind these ideas, and they were ideas that she kept going with for some years. And then I think also coming into the last years of her life, this sort of experimentation with materials and with exhibition design. She was always encouraging people to touch the work, although we can't do that now, unfortunately, but also kind of touch it with the eyes, this idea of actually having a sense of its tactility without necessarily having to physically touch it. There is something that is very relatable, this idea of balance and harmony within forms, and their natural forms, and often using natural materials. I think that it strikes a chord somewhere and does sort of fill you with calm, or, you know, there is a sense that it's right somehow.
Barbara Hepworth always wanted us to have a visceral response to her work, and she never stopped experimenting with ways to achieve this. She said in 1971, "I don't think anyone realizes how much the last 10 years has been a fulfillment of my youth."